Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's Glenn McKnight from VSIG, and I'm joined with Alfredo Calderon and Bill Juris. We welcome everyone to the call today, and we'll be recording this session, and it will be distributed in the discussion thread, also into the site itself. So it will be later today that the recording will be done. I'd like to welcome Marie. Thank you, Marie, for joining us today, all the way from Nevada, where the scorpions do. You can't have a paradise without some drawbacks. I understand it's a beautiful country, but the scorpions doesn't thrill me. But regardless, Marie, can you give a little bit of background on yourself? You know yourself better than I do, but we do know each other in passing through Aaron. But what about yourself? What can we? I know you're a vegan, right? So
I am.
that's
I'm the dreaded vegan. Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. So, hi. Thank you, Glenn. My name is Emery Brierley, and I am, well, as you said, mentioned, I live in Nevada. My background is in tech. And then I went over to the dark side and got my MBA. And so now I kind of see my role as building the bridges between different stakeholder communities and helping them to understand so we can all get to the same goal. I have a long history with Aaron. I am the two-time recipient of Aaron Community Grant Funds for IPv6 research. We're doing the world's only behavior-based IPv6 transition research. I've also been an Aaron Fellow. I had the opportunity to lead the IPv6 transition for Cisco.com. It was a harrowing 12, 13 months, but
Oh,
we were successful. We were successful in that and enabling 40 billion of their annual run rate. So now I just operate between both worlds, and I've had the opportunity to present at APNIC or APCOT, and now I'm presenting for you, Glenn.
we appreciate it, and so it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I had a disturbing conversation with a policy professional here in my area, and I mentioned something about IPv6 and cybersecurity, and her immediate response was, "Oh, our tech team's taking care of that." Okay, well, there's technical execution, but there's also governance. And so today I'd like to talk about minding the gap. If you're from Britain, this is a familiar phrase for you. And so we'll talk about the governance strategy and roles for invisible infrastructure. So here's our agenda for today. We'll talk about governance parity between my analogy for today, how to translate, hopefully a new translator role in some of the resources and terms that would be useful in that role. So infrastructure, we all have infrastructure. The infrastructure that we're all comfortable with is the physical infrastructure of transportation. We see it, we can touch it, feel it. Our policy professionals are very, very comfortable with a strategic layer of transportation infrastructure. But I find when it comes to the invisible infrastructure of the internet, they are still not very comfortable at all. And I think that's reflected in some of the policy decisions that get made. And so I'd like to kind of investigate today, how can we close that gap? So is there a great divide? I mean, maybe you're seeing much more aligned pursuit of invisible infrastructure policy, but I do see a great divide when I have these conversations. The challenge here is that the policy makers are enabling policy and creating policy for their constituents and consumers. And so if the policymakers aren't understanding some of those technical concepts and the strategic role they play, then they can't communicate that to their constituents and their consumers. And they're also not making policies that enforce that or enable that. So governance,
Sorry, Mary, to interrupt you, but we're
yes.
seeing the next slide and we're actually seeing your notes on the next slide.
Oh, I thought I turned that off. Okay,
All right.
thank you. So, hmm. Okay. Okay, now you're going to see all my slides.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Well, I
Mm,
had this off display. Okay. This was not on earlier. Nope. Okay. Here we go. Okay, is that better?
Let's see. Okay, yeah, correct, right.
Okay.
And Mary, I don't know if you want questions at the end or you want questions during your presentation, because I actually have a question for you.
Yes, actually, I built this around having a conversation during the presentation. So I did. So yes, please ask.
Okay, so I'm also a two-time Aaron Fellow, and a couple of years ago, I know that John Curran made a short speech talking about internet governance and how the tech people aren't aware of those policies and how the infrastructure process that they do impacts internet governance. So I'm guessing you're going to use that approach in your conversation.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. We'll get to that. So
Okay.
save more questions because I have a feeling they're coming.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so governance ecosystem. So today I'm going to pick transportation infrastructure as my analogy. So we want to translate some of these concepts from a concept our policymakers are comfortable with in trying to create analogies in the internet ecosystems. And so here you can see really clearly that there is a lot of stakeholder parity. A lot of the same groups are involved. Obviously, I think you've probably all seen the ISOC graphic on the right, and on the left is a transportation ecosystem graphic that I found, and there's just an incredible amount of overlap. The ISOC is a more detailed, clearly, but there's just so many different groups that have shared stakeholders roles in this conversation. So when we start translating, this is a super short list of things that can be of infrastructure that can be translated. You know, on the transportation infrastructure side, we've got all of these predictable things. We've got the two sections of traffic management and road materials. On the internet, we've got traffic management of a different kind of traffic. We've also got connection types. So one of the gaps that I've seen, I'm not going to talk about transportation because that's something everyone's really familiar with. But when we talk about internet infrastructure, again, it's invisible. And so they're not comfortable with having a conversation about these concepts and how they fit into a strategic plan. One of the things that I'm looking at right now is IXP planning. We've just in the United States had a lot of BEAD funding provisioned and budgeted, but no, they have the budget that they give to ISPs, but none of the policymakers are having a conversation about IXP planning and if we're adding if the goal is 100% accessibility, we've got to have IXPs to handle that load. And so no one's having that conversation. Another topic that is dear to my heart is IP addressing. If we're expanding the internet to that level, we don't have any IP addresses, and yet every time I bring up the global transition to V6, their eyes glaze over and they have no idea what I'm talking about or why I would be talking about that. Connection types. There's a lot of money when we talk about cable, fiber, or satellite. You know, obviously there's Wi-Fi and whatever. So when we're talking about those aspects, they would have a similar strategic conversation as we would for road material. Why am I picking a certain connection type? Why, you know, what's what budget for that? How expensive is it? Do I need to trench for that on the road on both sides actually? And so how do I just give money to people to get Starlink, which I have, and I'm not going to give a shout out to Elon Musk. This is not an ad for Elon Musk today. But I do have Starlink where I live. So when we talk about these, you know, concepts that do translate, they're very, very familiar with having to pick which use case gets which road material and how do you go about deciding that and how do you go about deciding who's going to build it and how do you budget for it. So those are concepts that are very easily translatable for your policymakers who don't want to have a technical conversation. On the application side, I mean, obviously an application is anything that the users interact with. And so on the transportation side, we've got our autos, we've got our bikes and scooters and all kinds of things that we have, and pedestrians, even walking traffic. You know, on the internet side, anything that's connected to the internet, we've got obviously servers, server farms, we've got IoT, we've got individual laptops and desktops. So there's a lot of devices that interact with that infrastructure on the internet side. The commerce backbone, we're very comfortable with the tangibility of moving commerce with trucks and trains. We're not as comfortable having the conversation about the e-commerce backbone, which is, you know, it may be an e-commerce company, which, you know, we're obviously Amazon, Alibaba, and the rest of them. But the e-commerce is also any company that does business over the internet has some element of e-commerce. And I would even say that goes as far as influencers. Those are smaller e-commerce businesses that rely on the internet to do business. And so when we talk to policymakers, how do we convince them that their policy needs to support both those larger e-commerce companies and the smaller e-commerce users that are not Amazon? With safety in the transportation infrastructure world, then we've got our safety is we rely much more on public agencies for our safety. We kind of step back. We're very spoiled and we're accustomed to having a safe country for the most part. But we rely on our agencies to keep us safe. On the internet, that's not enough. Agencies obviously do have a role in keeping us safe, but the fact is, a lot of the breaches come from from social engineering and convincing the individual themselves. So how do our safety policies support the individual accountability that's required on the internet? We can't just rely on public safety agencies to keep us safe on the internet. And how do those policies support that? The governance layer, we really need to ensure that whatever we're doing aligns to the strategic outcomes. That means we need to be very aware of what those strategic goals are. A little bit later, we'll talk about the roles, and perhaps there's a career path that's possible through this path, but we really need to be aware of what the overlying strategic goals are. When I had a conversation with a state, one of the state tech people at the head of the agency about selling their V4 addresses, this individual went to their network team and asked if we were going to transition to V6. Well, when there's a possibility of monetizing a taxpayer-owned asset, like an IP address, then is that really serving a strategic outcome when we're talking about an asset that could be monetized on behalf of the taxpayers? And is that really the decision of a technical execution team? And I would say it is not. That was something a strategic decision maker should have decided, and they were not comfortable making that decision, and they just relied on their technical team. Accountability to key stakeholders. We looked at those ecosystem graphs earlier, but this piece is extremely difficult. They all have their different goals. They all have what they think the internet should be, and so which piece of it are we going to be accountable to which stakeholders? So how do we match those infrastructure pieces, those invisible infrastructure pieces, to which stakeholder group? Funding models are very complex. Is it a private public partnership? Is it a grant model? Is it do I get grant funds from an agency and then I just go off and do my own thing? Right now, we've got some lawsuits coming up in Nevada because part of the BEAD funding was handed out to an ISP, and now we don't, without any performance goals or measures, and now no one knows where the money went. So, Glenn.
Sorry, for the benefit of those who don't know what BEAD is, would you mind explaining what the U.S. policy on BEAD is?
Yes, BEAD was part of President Biden's policy, and he allocated funds to bring broadband to all the underserved communities in the U.S., including rural areas. And so that then there were applications, and so they went out to there was an RFP that went out to all the ISPs, and then they were selected from that pool of applicants, and they have published who is going to receive those funds. Unfortunately, they handed them over. What happens a lot of times in federal grants is that they hand out a piece of the money at a time. They don't just hand over the whole budget at in one fell swoop. And then there's some performance measures, and so that was not done here, and now the money has disappeared into other pockets, and we don't have.
So my understanding is with the current administration, BEAD funding might be cut, or it will not be a program under the Trump administration. Is that right?
I don't know how they're going to do that when a lot of that funding's, I mean, they've already broken ground in a lot of places. Even in Nevada, I know we broke ground on fiber over a year ago.
Okay.
So that's going to be difficult. I hope they would allow that to continue. They may shift to a different delivery model for those places where they haven't broken ground. There would be an opportunity to rethink. I mean, a lot of people here have been very skeptical for this very reason, where the money goes to where the money always goes, and then it never goes to the underserved populations that it was allocated for. And so there's some pushbacks, suggesting that maybe they should have just given everyone a Starlink. It would have been less expensive, right? Instead of trenching. Trenching is extremely expensive. Alfredo, did I answer your question, Glenn?
Yeah, thank you. It's important for the students to understand what that BEAD is and its ability to provide internet connectivity to poor rural and tribal lands in the U.S. So it's been a huge success as a whole.
Yes, and actually here in Puerto Rico, which is a territory of the United States, we were one of the first territories to get approved the funding for the BEAD program, and we've already started deploying it, and we have universities and NGOs already involved in training and educating underserved communities within the island, and at the same time building the infrastructure through the telecoms. The biggest telecoms we have here in the island, or ISP providers, if I may. So it's moving forward, but yes, we're actually afraid that some of the money might be held back if we don't, publish no fos and no fuss, so that money can be appropriated accordingly. So I just wanted to add
and
that.
I would say having a ready case for saying, no, this money has been effective. It has delivered, the way we've allocated the funds locally is it has delivered that value. So, that's going to make it more difficult for them to just yank funding. But yeah, and the concern is there going to be a conflict with Musk? Because clearly that's not his business model. So he has a different business model. So I have not heard anything that it has been yanked, but I mean, everything's seems to be on the table right now.
May I jump in for a sec? I'm suggesting to the students to read the section in the development module. We do provide details on initiatives that are by the UN and particularly ISOC on providing grants and funding for connecting the disconnected or unconnected communities. So any of you folks that are involved with this, please lean heavy on this, and it's well worth looking at the success and obviously challenges and failures of any program.
Mhm.
We have a similar program in Canada, which is for the First Nations. Very large land, very
Mhm.
expensive to put fiber,
Mhm.
and for a very small amount of people. So it's an economy of scale, right? And some people take it upon themselves. And some very interesting stuff that I've seen
Mhm.
in cooperatives that were in Spain and elsewhere, where people take upon themselves and they own the local ISP, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, it's a big challenge. Great. Thank you so much, Marie. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay. Yeah. So, to your point about people taking ownership of it, you may know Jared Mach, and I know him from IETF. He's up in Michigan, and he wanted to get internet service to his remote home, and I think Comcast was giving him a quota of $50,000 to trench, right?
Wow.
And so he had the skill. And so, years later, he's now the local ISP, and he's gotten multiple grants to do his own trenching and be an ISP to serve his rural community. So the other one that I'd like to point out is Dr. Ano Purbo, I think is his name, in Indonesia. And if I misspoke his country, I apologize. But he figured out a way to make cooking utensils, the woks and the pans, into local um, uh, transceivers. So, and so I'm trying to find a way to get all of our abandoned satellite dishes here in Nevada. We have a lot of them, and trying to get them shipped over to him so that they can expand their access. So, my stopping point right now is getting transportation and shipping from Africa. I understand that I can't ship used electronics directly to Southeast Asia for the trash reason. They don't want our e-waste. So trying to navigate that and get them some upgraded equipment.
I think Alfredo wanted to jump in. Alfredo, were you going to say something or add?
No, no, I wasn't. Thank you.
Okay.
One of the projects I did when I was on the board with ISOG, I brought a whole bunch of TP-Link devices, and we set up a small point-to-point system in actually a friend of mine in Uganda. I don't know whatever happened to that system, but there's a chap that runs a CCNSO called Barak Oteo. You guys may know Barak, but him and I were looking at. I brought a bunch of laptops, just like you said. It's tough to bring stuff in, but I was managed to bring six unused older laptops with Ubuntu to my friend in Kenya, and we for his school. But there's so much opportunity of older disused technology
Mhm.
if you use an open source software to take it, but you get barriers, you get
Mhm.
challenges. I managed to get them in. Maybe I smiled or something, or something happened, but I was able to get them in. But yeah, there's so much stuff out there that it may be not the most new or best stuff,
Mhm.
but some great stuff. But I think there was a very good example in RIPE, the last RIPE event last year, where they talked about how people from the West, Germany, Netherlands, they actually went into Ukraine and were setting up, internet connectivity in areas which were victims of the bombing by Russia.
Mhm. Yeah, I've heard, and I think Musk went in there and did some of that as well. So yeah, um, yeah. For something that's so powerful, when you hear about these stories, you just realize how vulnerable the internet actually is, and how closing these gaps between what the policymakers thinks are happening versus the technical execution teams, and getting a common language. I mean, it really is a translation layer, and you have to be multilingual to make those connections, I find. um yes. So in the governance layer, obviously measuring your progress and success. We just had a kind of a conversation about that. If you are saying that you're going to do something, you do really need to have accountability to the people who funded you. Just because right now I think money supply might get even tighter. The the grants always have a set of criteria that you have to align to. And so I would say that being proactive about how you're going to measure something is going to be even more important. And coordination of complexity, the topic that we're talking about, when we talk about being multilingual, the level of complexity on the policy side and the number of stakeholders and their different goals. And when you add in how complex technology can be, internet technology can be, you really do need to be successful in making these arguments, is to be able to master that level of complexity. And you're always in a mindset of translating one side to the other. Translation, the strategic value. We talk about tech people. So I'm just going to say, on my business side, I have advisors who have invested quite a bit of time beating the tech speak out of me. My safety zone is to go straight for the detail. And when you're talking to a policymaker, that just is just their eyes glaze over on your third syllable. So that's just not going to be successful when you want to convince this policymaker to pursue a certain strategy for policy for you. So it's always important to understand what's important to them. The strategic value. Yeah, I don't want to talk about accessibility or I need fiber to go out of this area because they've got health, they don't have access. A policymaker is going to want to know that these people have a certain level of increased health risk, and how do we make this infrastructure, this invisible infrastructure, reduce that risk for them? They don't want to hear about, an undersea cable, but they might want to hear about global economic development. And if you're forcing developing economy and emerging economy to support 2 IP addressing protocols, and that's going to put an unacceptable economic burden on developing their internet infrastructure. It might limit who you can partner with. If you're trying to partner with a country who has challenges with their government turning the internet off, then that's going to be a problem as well. So that you need to put it in their terms. The participation of the underserved. I mean, people that use the internet very differently. Different cultures are going to be using the internet very differently than what we expect, right? Which is great, but I'm just going to give a shout out to all the women entrepreneurs who, when they get internet access, they are the first and most enthusiastic adopters of the internet because they can start feeding their family more reliably. They're very aggressive and creative on making the internet work for them in terms of entrepreneurial goals. And then obviously they're taking care of their families. What we're seeing right now is language preservation. That is on the radar for a lot of policymakers. And so that's really important. So there's a lot of effort going on in that area. And so how do we say that, yes, but adding, doing these, enabling these policies is actually going to serve language preservation. So it's always about the strategic value and what's important to that policymaker at the time. And of course, those change. So these are not fixed in stone. Next year, they may have a whole different set of values that you have to align to. So let's talk about how do we get from a function conversation to a value conversation. So of course, I always work in IP. My sweet spot is IP addressing. So the function is that we need to transit the internet. We need the devices to be identified. But a feature means that it's interoperable. So when we're talking about the federal government has now, this year is when they're required to have 80% of their systems support IPv6. So how are you enabling policy to make sure that your companies and your, and your stakeholders can interoperate with the federal government, because they're not going to be supporting both those protocols forever because it's just so expensive. And so when we talk about unique identity for geolocation and cybersecurity reasons, how do you get unique identity? Well, you have to have a policy that says we need to move forward to the new IP addressing protocol because that cannot be achieved with the old one. And then when we talk about the value, we're talking about frictionless partnerships. So what they want to hear is that my accurate customer targeting, which means I have a greater opportunity for realizing revenue. If I'm marketing and I've got geolocation, which I rely very heavily on, then my geolocation needs to be accurate. And then I can't achieve that with V4 either. So I'll tell you a big secret. So I have a drinking game. And so every time I'm correctly geolocated, I take a shot. Guess how many shots I've had? 0, because I get geolocated to Kansas, LA, and Seattle all the time. So again, we need to get our heads out of our function brains and start talking about what the strategic value is and how those policies can support those values. So it's all about you. So you are the translator. When it comes to translating the
Sorry, Marie. We have a question from Brenda.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. Yes, Brenda.
Yes, you talked about frictionless partnerships.
Uh-huh.
I'm inquiring about your experience where governments or policyholders tend to have tensions with corporate actors who are in charge of developing infrastructures. Most of them are intent on making profits, while governments and policyholders are interested in advancing the interests of the public. What comments do you have on addressing those tensions between public interests and then corporate actors' interests in profits?
I think it's important to find some value in the middle, and I would say baby steps. I mean, it's very incremental, right? I mean, and then it comes back to relationships. I think it's very difficult, and I think a lot of us experience, like I was talking about earlier, that some BEAD funding just went out the door with no gate, no controls on it, and now we don't know where the money is, and so that can't be allowed. So I think from the policymakers' perspective, putting controls on that, saying you're not getting your next round of funding until you can prove to us that you've already spent the last round of funding the way we intended you to spend it, particularly with this BEAD funding and how it affects rural the rural population and underserved populations. They're new to the internet and may not be able to express. They don't know what they don't know yet, so it's difficult to express that, and so they're relying on policymakers to do that. From the private perspective, that's difficult because if they don't make profit, they don't exist, right? And so where's the line between where that is abused? So I would say, since the policymakers are going to be the ones that are allocating funds, that you make those very clearly stated performance milestones and make sure that they're met before more funds go out the door. But there's always going to be that tension. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to reach a point where there's no tension there.
I'm curious, Brenda. You obviously asked a question. You've thought this through. Is there experience that you have? Does what Marie say resonates with your experience in this topic?
Yes, if you've read Langdon's theory, Politics of Technology, first of all, I believe that's common out there. Then here in Africa, Uganda in particular, where I am, we have smartphones. Most of these devices, infrastructure developments are just imposed by corporate actors from the global north. We cannot have a say whether you like it or not.
Oh, I see.
The only thing I can implore of you as VSIG is that we need research on the impact of foreign policy in the global south, digital foreign policy. What is it that we can do for all those who are interested in both the global north and global south? I don't like referring myself to as a participant in global south, the global majority at that. Thank you.
Yeah. Maria, you want us to respond?
Yeah, and so do I understand that part of Africa is just being made to accept whatever a different part of Africa is deploying, and there's no discussion? Do I understand you correctly?
No, all I'm saying is that the discussions are scanty and we have limited research. Even research which is
Oh,
available is
okay.
hardly published, not only in Africa, but also that side. Am I right? Please, if you do have articles you can share, because whatever you're discussing is political. We
Mhm.
do have interests, as you said, balancing the tensions is not easy. Public interest versus corporate actors' interest in profits, and the emerging trade wars we're hearing, Trump's policies, trade wars, what is it that we're going to do? It's a discussion that all of us need to be engaged in. Thank you.
Yeah, and part of it is a chicken or egg question. If you don't have access to the internet and can't participate, then you're even more vulnerable, right? Then you don't have a voice. So I think that makes it much more challenging to make yourself heard. Again, I think Africa has amazing entrepreneurs who take things into their own hands sometimes. So, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm certainly not an expert on Africa, but again, even in the United States, competition is critical, and having multiple choices with providers is still challenging. We don't have a huge amount of competition. So, and there's a lot of merger and acquisition that happens, and it will continue to happen. And so how do we have a voice? Like, if you don't want to use social media, then you don't sign the EULA, and then you don't get access to it, and you don't have a voice. So you're kind of forced to do what they want you to do. And that's a role of private companies. So the tension will always be there. I would still say that the framework applies in understanding what everyone's end goal is, and trying to very carefully incrementally tread the pieces of that where you can bring those people, those parties together, stakeholders together. But it's not easy. And the research is important, but showing up to, I don't know what forums you have that enable you to have a voice with your policymakers. So I would say definitely get to know them, and be part of that process. So did that address your concern, Brenda, or did I completely go off topic?
Thank you. You've been honest. It's not easy.
No.
It's not easy. We need to research, and yeah.
Yeah.
What you shared is upon all of us to take a step and do something about it. Thank you.
And I'm going to be really simplistic about it. I mean, it boils down to relationships and to how you communicate. And so the biggest challenge in communication is listening. So we always want to have, we all have information that we want people to know, but if they're not ready to hear it, or if they're, if we're talking a language they don't understand, then our message has been lost. And so it really is about communication and relationships at the end of the day. Alfredo, see you have your hand up.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to add to the conversation that the Internet Society, ISOC, and Brenda, I don't know if you're aware of all the white papers they have out there, and they even have some programs where you can ask for some funding to build some community networks in some areas in Africa. And that could be a starting point. If you can build the infrastructure and make your community use it, maybe the politicians could understand the power that it brings to the table and to the economy of the nation or the state or the community. The other thing is, Brenda, that ICANN is also working towards that, to making sort of the multi-stakeholder model where we can get all the stakeholders together and understand the importance of the end user's perspective, which I am a member of the at-large community in ICANN, and we're working towards that as well. So to your questions about case studies and research, I'll try to look up some research papers that you can look at, and maybe that'll help you out in your quest. I hope that helps you as well, Brenda.
Thank you, Alfredo. Oh, I'm sorry, Glenn. Thank you, Alfredo. I just have one concern towards ISOC. The last grant, which was advertised in late 2024 targeted registered entities. So grassroots entities which struggle with registration requirements as per government policies, not only in East Africa, but within the whole of Africa, are always excluded. I'm aware of those ISOC grants, and one of the Ugandan organizations, National Association for Women Organizations, got one. Then majority of the other, I saw Kenya took a huge share from the African continent. So that's a point that you need to make towards ISOC. How can they include grassroots entities which are financially constrained and cannot access legal registration services in their countries? Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Brenda. And actually, I think it's on Tuesday, a couple of us, when I say us, I'm also an ISOC member. We're going to have a conversation with Sally, the new CEO president of ISOC, specifically about that, because in our case in Puerto Rico, we also have some issues with that, and we share your burden as well in some cases. So we're going to make that point as well. Thank you.
Yeah, we see that here in the US, you know, that the bigger ones get the money, and then what happens to all the smaller stakeholders is they're always more vulnerable. Brenda?
I think Bill, oh, okay. So
Oh.
who's next? I got to see, okay, Brenda's hand is down. Alfredo, you have another comment? Your hand's up. Okay, it's down.
Okay.
One of the interesting people to read and is a chap named Corey Doctoroff. And I'm just going to put a link to his bio in Craphound. That's his blog he does, but he has done a very good presentation to libraries in recovery. That's a group that meets every Thursday, and I think Alfredo was last Thursday, right? They talked about the BEAD funding. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, Marie, but he didn't do the presentation last Thursday, but there was a discussion of BEAD. But I recommend Corey Doctoroff, who's I would guess he would be more on the left side of thinking in terms of critical of the companies that are implementing a lot of these things. Like we see, Elon Musk has got $38 billion. He was one of the biggest recipients with the largest from the federal government. And now he says, cut government. But when there was lots of fat in the system, he definitely benefited from it. So I guess I think what Brenda is saying is fairness, you know, technology transfer. There's a lot of complicated stuff here. And we can, there was another writer, Alfredo, my brain is not working as well. The University of Berkeley professor, he wrote a book called Internet for All or Internet for Everyone, a fairly leftist treatise, another one worth reading. It might be in our section, but it's hard to say. But Maria, we have about 10 minutes left. So back to you.
Okay, great. So I'll go through these. So I really like to challenge all the attendees of VSIG to make themselves a translator and kind of carve out that role. You can come from a technical background, or you can come from a more business project program manager role, but the fact is you need to understand both sides in depth in order to build those bridges. So again, communicate in analogies your audience is familiar with. I selected transportation infrastructure today, but pick whichever analogy you think will resonate with your audience. Remember, this is always about your communicating to your audience in terms of what they're comfortable with. Communicate early impact of the policy standards and industry trends that you see around the world. So that means being active in ICANN, in ISOC, NANOG, your RIR. Be ahead of the game. Always be that person that says, hey, this standard is coming up and it will affect your community, this particular group of your stakeholders. So be that person who understands what that early impact will be. You can get on mailing lists if you can't attend in person. They all have mailing lists, and also with federal policies that come out. You can get on those mailing lists. Make actionable sense out of many moving parts. This is just so complex, but you are successful in that role when you can make all of those moving parts actionable by a policymaker. Make it understandable to them where they can see the value, and then they can take action on your behalf, or on behalf of the stakeholders. And I'm going to say something a little bit controversial. I think the ability to master this level of complexity from this many moving parts may allow you to be more competitive when we're looking at job changes with AI. I don't think AI is terribly smart yet. So sorry, but you know, I've seen a lot of mistakes. And so, it's not this highly integrated. So you as a person who wants to pursue a career, I think you may have a window here where being able to communicate and build that integrative argument for a policymaker may allow you to beat AI for a while. And obviously you need to be the expert on your entity's purpose and operations. You can't have this, the technology conversation unless you understand what your entity or your stakeholders, what they want. So again, I'm going to stress that the communication needs to be what they want in a language that they understand. And see, these are some of the resources where you can get some of this information. So what we have here is the schedule. So GSA in the United States, we have these federal schedules where you submit for contracts. They have requirements. Be aware, get on those mailing lists and understand what those requirements are. And if you're not in the United States, then there may be some global entities that you could do this, or your own government. FARs and DFARs, here we have federal acquisition requirements and Department of Defense federal acquisition requirements, because we like long acronyms. And so get on those mailing lists for IT related issues. All the interoperability and regulations. One of the gaps that we found is that with the BEAD fund, so a few years ago, the OMB issued memo 2107, and everyone in the United States knows about OMB 2107, where it dictated the federal agencies needed to be V6 capable 80% of their systems by the end of this fiscal year, which is in September. And then they turn around and issue BEAD funding and did not make IPv6 a requirement in those RFPs. So none of those ISPs care. And if they weren't already on the path to V6 transition, then the BEAD funding certainly did not encourage them to do so. So there was a pretty big gap there. So that's where you can add value and to say, well, you're requiring something over here, but now you're not requiring it over here, and there's a gap. And that can be a performance measure as well. And the same thing with global interoperability. I mean, it's a global world, right? If you've got regulations and interoperability issues in countries that or even internet shutdowns, you need to be ahead of that. You as a translator need to be ahead of that and understand what that looks like. And I think we've all seen ISOCs. They are doing an excellent job of keeping track of internet shutdowns. So they do publish that on a regular basis. Funding sources. In the United States, we have grants.gov, which is where a lot of the grants come from. And we also have SAM, which is the System for Awards Management, which is expanded to grants and contracts. Industry groups like NANOG, and Internet Policy and Standards Organization, IETF, ISOC, ICANN, and your regional registrar. So all of these sources, and there's many more, but all of these sources have email that you can subscribe to. Thank you so much. And I put a backup, that slide did not pixelate, they pixelated it a little bit. So anyway, so I have sorry.
Would you mind sending this slideshow to me so I can make an ebook, and I'll share then people don't have to bother you to get a copy of it. I'll create it as an ebook, but if you can, as a PDF, if you can.
Yes. So
wow.
I put some of those links here.
Yeah, I see that. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. I never expected it to be as thick or in dense as this. I'm not patronizing. It made my brain explode this morning. There's so much.
In a good way, I hope.
Yeah, I like the term you did, translator, because that clearly is something we have. We do it in languages, but we feel we have an important role in boiling down the complex concepts, expanding people's horizons on this. Alfredo, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I would like to have Mary participate in the next cohort, and instead of 1 hour, give her a couple of hours. I mean, there's so much we can talk about.
Yeah.
I have so many questions for you, but time's up.
Well, you know where to find me, Alfredo. So we can go offline if you like.
Sure. Are you
Well,
going to be in Seattle for ICANN?
I haven't even looked at schedules yet. So I was
Oh,
kind of hoping to be at the Aaron policy meeting in North Carolina in April. Yeah. And today, speaking of policymakers, I'm actually heading over to the Nevada legislature today, and I'll be participating for 2 days. So I also serve as Nevada's Center for Excellence in Disabilities, their community advisory committee out of UNR. And so that's what my role will be. I'm leaving right after this to go there. So that'll be my first actual feet on the ground policy experience. So I may have I may be crying later today, but yes, but I'd be happy to participate in anything you think would be helpful.
oh, sure. Actually, you just mentioned a couple of things in which I am also involved. I'm involved in accessibility and disability issues. I'm involved with the telemedicine here in the island, telehealth, and an initiative we have in the island with the federal government. And I actually participated last week in a policy meeting with the commissioner, resident commissioner of Puerto Rico in Washington, D.C., discussing the BEADS fund and its future and how we can get involved in procuring that money is not taken back from us down the road. So,
Yeah,
so
and
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
So I always see that we always think about the cost of reaching the underserved, but the fact is, I see that as an investment in untapped potential. So, it is quantifiable. Last week, speaking of research, last week I had the opportunity to present to an interdisciplinary audience of second-year med students at their medical school at UNR to say we need research on this particular thing. So it's always trying to translate into what someone else is interested in and bringing issues to them that they don't even know exist. They don't know what they don't know. And there's just so much of it with
Yeah,
the
exactly.
power of the internet. Yeah.
Yeah, here in Puerto Rico, we have 4 schools of medicine, and I actually had a month ago a meeting with the presidents of those institutions to revise their curriculum because they're not talking about internet governance and policy and how that impacts telehealth and the services they provide online. So yeah, you and I, we need to talk a lot.
Yeah, Stanford Hospital did a video and a story about a portion of my medical case, so I'll send that over to you.
Okay, thank you.
I want to point out to you, Marie, that we're organizing the North American School of Internet Governance in October. I don't know the date yet, but we haven't really settled on the theme yet. But my brain is starting to think here. So because you may be called upon to be a panel member of a committee, because I do know the person responsible for the program, and he's to the right of you.
Hey. I was actually thinking exactly what you're thinking, Glenn. So
that's dangerous. That's dangerous. I'd like to call upon Bill. Bill, any observations, comments?
I've got a lot of experience with translation as putting things into words people can understand. We have, Brenda mentioned earlier the fondness of the US government for long, complex acronyms. I would point out that ICANN, which is an acronym, is at least as enthused. And it's a serious barrier to anybody trying to get involved, figuring out what the devil people are talking about with all those acronyms. So I think this applies generally when you're talking about the internet, is figuring out how do we explain this, not just in non-technical terms, but in terms that the specific audience can understand. And it can be a real challenge. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a discipline, because that's the very first place I go is my tech speak. So
when you started to do the analogy between the physical transportation system and the infrastructure, obviously what I thought of immediately is Al Gore's internet highway or super highway.
oh yeah.
And how he took the credit for that. He didn't talk about the potholes or the off ramps or the tolls, or just, everything was clean sailing. But it's interesting looking back in history, how after the Second World War, one of the things the Americans brought back, he said, I like that Autobahn idea. And so the whole undermine, not to increase efficiency, but how can we create a network just in case the Russians attack us, right? So the opus operandi of that whole transportation system was there was a reason for it, based on policy. So it's the same thing when we dig deeper, but the cat's out of the bag now. The people who had the white jackets and the computers, they were critical in creating the internet, but there's so much more that people are claiming and wanting to be involved. The dispossessed people who are seniors, poor people, new immigrants. There's so many people that in order to enable them to provide them access to the wider society, medical records, on and on and on, they require internet access, and it's essential as water, or it's a human right. So it's an interesting challenge we have.
Yeah, particularly when most private companies are now, no one prints content anymore. It's always we'll get it on the internet. Well, if you don't have access to the internet, you've got no way to access it at all. So
Exactly.
it's over for you, yeah.
So Mary, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. And as I mentioned, we hope to have you again so we can have a deeper discussion and have more audience asking questions like all the questions we have in our minds.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Hey, we'll see you someplace.
Yeah,
Not sure. I'm not sure where, but
one of those meetings.
thank you again. Thank you everybody for joining us. That concludes the call today, and the recording will be up as soon as possible. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.